Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So, usually when we talk about a structural integrity test, there's this expectation of extreme, highly visible stress.
Oh, absolutely. Like an earthquake simulation or something.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You think of engineers putting a model building on this massive shake table, and they crank up the lateral vibrations. Everyone in the lab is just watching with bated breath to see, when is the concrete going to crack? When is the steel going to finally bend?
Yeah, it's violent, and it's incredibly loud.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the threat to the structure is aggressively obvious.
It's a very binary, visually dramatic kind of test, right? The building either stands up to the pressure, absorbing all that kinetic energy, or it just collapses in the spectacular fashion. And because of that visual drama, we naturally assume that the greatest threats we will ever face, whether that's, as individuals or as organizations or even entire societies, are going to be those massive, unavoidable external shocks.
I always thought that way. You brace for the earthquake. But then you step into the world of human character and you look at historical survival, and suddenly that loud, violent shake table isn't the only thing you have to worry about at all.
No, not even close.
Right. We're looking at a landscape today in this deep dive where the most lethal threat to a structure might not be an earthquake at all. It might be this perfectly quiet, perfectly comfortable, climate-controlled environment where something totally invisible is just quietly, methodically eating away at the foundation from the inside.
It is the absolute definition of a hidden structural failure. And, that hidden vulnerability juxtaposed with the overt violent test is a fascinating paradox we are unpacking today. We're looking at a stack of historical commentaries focusing on chapters 33 through 39 of the Qur'an. And just to be crystal clear about our lens today, we are approaching these texts objectively.
Right, purely as profound historical and philosophical documents.
Exactly. We aren't taking sides in theological debates, and we certainly aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints left or right. Our focus is entirely on analyzing the historical narratives, the ancient social laws, and the extensive commentaries to extract this sort of universal blueprint for surviving both absolute disaster and absolute success.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it feels like the overarching narrative here is pointing to a really brutal battle between integrity and comfort.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is.
Like if you look at chapter 33, which is titled The Allies, and then you look right after it at chapter 34, titled Saba, you get this intense whiplash.
Oh, massive whiplash. The contrast is stark.
Right. The central message seems to be that human integrity is squeezed between two totally opposing forces. On one side, you have the external pressure, so fear, adversity, literal warfare.
Yes.
And then on the other side, you have this internal pressure, luxury, wealth, and deep complacency. And if I look at my own life, I just naturally assume my biggest tests are the disasters.
The crises, right.
Exactly. The unexpected health crisis or some massive financial loss. But reading these accounts, it seems to argue that hitting the jackpot, getting exactly what you want, is astronomically more dangerous.
What's fascinating here is how deliberately the historical records set up that contrast. Let's look at chapter 33. You have a nascent community of believers in 7th century Arabia being tested by a terrifying, truly existential siege.
They were just barely surviving.
Exactly. They are starving, they are freezing in the desert winter, and they are surrounded by a massive confederation of armies that explicitly wants to wipe them completely off the map.
It is the ultimate external shake table.
Right. But then, almost immediately, the narrative in chapter 34 pivots. It moves to the people of Saba, which was a prominent ancient city in Yemen, and it also brings in the successors of King Solomon.
And their test is totally different.
Completely different. It isn't a siege. It is immense wealth. They have perfect weather, they have abundant fail-proof harvests, and they live in just total uninterrupted ease.
It's so jarring. You literally go from a community starving in a ditch, eating handfuls of dates just to stay alive, to a society sitting in a palace complaining about the ambient temperature.
It is jarring, yeah. But it is deeply, deeply intentional. The overarching argument here is that physical threats, as utterly terrifying as they are, often force a psychological consolidation.
They clarify your values.
Yes, exactly. When you are starving in a trench, you know exactly what matters. There's no ambiguity. But the accounts argue that ease engenders a very specific kind of evil.
The sort of rot.
Right. When you have everything, when the struggle is entirely removed from your daily existence, a psychological decay sets in. True wisdom, according to these chapters, isn't just about surviving the sword.
It's about maintaining your center.
Maintaining your moral compass, yeah. Regardless of whether you are shivering in a trench with a 10,000-man army outside or sitting on a throne surrounded by endless agricultural bounty.
Man, that really demands that you, the listener, look at your own life and ask a really uncomfortable question. Am I failing the test of adversity, or am I actually failing the test of comfort?
Oof, yeah, it's a tough one.
Because we love to complain about the adversity, we talk about it constantly, but we rarely audit our comfort.
We just accept it as a given or a reward.
Right. So to really grasp how this plays out in real time, I want to dive deep into the historical context of that physical siege in chapter 33. Because the surviving accounts paint an incredibly vivid, almost cinematic scene.
It really is cinematic.
We are in Medina. It's the 4th year of the Hijra. You have this relatively small Muslim community, and they suddenly find themselves surrounded by this massive confederation of idolaters and rival tribes. We are talking about 10,000 hardened soldiers.
Just to put the sheer scale of that threat into perspective for a second, contemporary historians observed that this was arguably the most powerful, concerted attack directed against the Muslims in their early history.
Basically, the whole region against them.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The attacking force numbered more than 10 times the available Muslim defenders.
10-to-1 odds.
10-to-1 odds, yeah. And in the context of ancient warfare, where you're looking at hand-to-hand combat as the norm, those are apocalyptic odds.
And what I find so compelling is that the text doesn't shy away from the psychological horror of this reality.
No, it's very blunt.
Right. It doesn't paint the believers as these fearless, stoic superheroes who just calmly sharpen their swords. It describes the visceral reality of it. It says, eyes turned dull and the hearts rose up to the throats.
Which is such an evocative phrase.
It's not just poetry, though. Oh. That is the literal physiological response to sheer, unadulterated panic. Adrenaline is dumping into their systems, their vision is narrowing, they're hyperventilating. It is profoundly human.
It really grounds the story in reality. And to survive that, the prophet makes a tactical decision to remain within the town rather than meet them in the open field.
Which was unusual for them, right?
It was, but they were so outnumbered. So they literally dig a massive trench, a massive ditch around the exposed parts of the city as a desperate protective measure.
And we really shouldn't gloss over the physical reality of that trench either. They were digging into solid, rocky, Arabian soil.
In the dead of winter.
Yes. The records mention the battle, and the siege continued for several weeks in this freezing, biting cold. They were on starvation rations.
But, while that physical siege was grueling, the real focus of the historical analysis is the psychological warfare happening inside the city walls.
This is where we see the concept of structural integrity really tested.
Exactly. You had a faction within the city that the accounts identify as the hypocrites.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about them.
These were individuals who professed loyalty and solidarity when things were, peaceful and profitable.
When it was easy to be on the team.
Right. But the absolute second that 10,000-man army showed up on the horizon, the facade completely cracked.
They started spreading panic.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they didn't just run away screaming. That would be too obvious. They tried to rationalize their cowardice.
Oh, the rationalizations are amazing to read.
The historical records quote them making these very polite, seemingly reasonable excuses, asking the prophet for permission to lead the defensive line at the trench. Their excuse was, surely our houses are exposed.
It is an absolute masterclass in human rationalization, and the historical commentary immediately dissects the lie. It states definitively, like right there in the text, and they were not exposed, they only desired to fly away.
They just wanted to bail.
Exactly! They were using the pretense of domestic responsibility, I have to go protect my property, my family is vulnerable, to mask their sheer terror. They needed plausible deniability for abandoning their posts. The analysis suggests that if an enemy had managed to actually breach the city walls and invited this exact same group to join the attacking forces and share in the plunder, they would have switched sides in a heartbeat.
It's a brilliant psychological study of how extreme fear reveals true allegiances, right?
Yes, exactly.
When the pressure hits that critical threshold, whatever is truly inside of you just comes spilling out, whether that's bravery or treachery.
It all gets exposed on the shake table.
Right. I want to push on that a bit, though, because the physical siege from the outside wasn't the only battle they were fighting.
No, not at all.
While all this external pressure is happening, The sources detail a completely different kind of siege happening on the domestic front.
The social siege.
Yeah. The community of Medina, prior to this massive attack, had actually started to win some skirmishes. They were gaining some territory. And with that came a brand new reality for them, which was affluence.
Wealth was suddenly flowing into the city.
Right. And naturally, human nature being what it is, the prophet's wives wanted to share in this newfound prosperity.
Which makes sense.
Totally makes sense. They were looking around, seeing other people in the community upgrading their homes, wearing finer clothes, and they basically wanted the same.
Which brings us to that internal social siege. And, to fully understand the stakes of this internal conflict, we really have to deeply contextualize the ingrained customs of 7th century Arabia.
Because this movement was actively, and sometimes really aggressively, dismantling those customs.
Very aggressively. It wasn't just about money. It was about totally restructuring societal power dynamics. For example, chapter 33 opens by directly attacking and abolishing a deeply cruel, culturally entrenched practice called zihar.
Yeah, let's really dig into zihar, because when I read the source material on this, it was genuinely shocking, but it also felt like something out of, an alien culture.
To modern ears, it definitely sounds bizarre. But it was a brutal form of psychological and social control. In that specific tribal era, if an Arab man got angry with his wife, he could pronounce a highly specific, legally binding phrase. He would say, "You are to me as the back of my mother."
Which, again, sounds like a very strange, very specific insult today. But I know in an honor-shame tribal culture, words aren't just words.
No, they're the fabric of the law.
Right. So what did uttering that specific phrase actually do to the woman?
Well, in a society without formal written contracts, without a centralized police force or a municipal court system, an uttered oath was absolute reality.
The word was law.
Precisely. When a man said that phrase, customary law dictated that the conjugal relationship was instantly and permanently severed. She was now forbidden to him sexually, just as his own mother would be.
Wow.
However, and this is the truly horrifying part, it was not a divorce.
So she's trapped.
Exactly. She was not at liberty to leave his house. She could not return to her family. She could not remarry. She could not move on with her life in any capacity.
She's stuck.
She was treated as a deserted wife, essentially suspended in a state of indefinite legal purgatory right within her own home. She was stripped of the rights of a wife, but denied the freedom of a divorced woman.
That is wild.
It was a tool of ultimate spite, really, designed to hold a woman hostage to a man's anger indefinitely.
That is just systemic cruelty.
Yeah.
It's trapping someone in an emotional and legal void where they essentially cease to exist as an independent human being.
And it was completely accepted as the norm.
And the text just comes right out and abolishes it. It just overwrites centuries of tribal law like that.
It completely annihilates the practice. And the argument presented is profound in its simplicity, really. The text basically says mere assertion doesn't change reality.
Right.
The text declares that a wife cannot physically or legally be made a mother simply because an angry man utters the sequence of words.
Just because you say it doesn't make it true.
Exactly. It dismantles this unjust custom, not through some complex legal loophole, but just on the grounds of objective truth and basic equity. A lie doesn't become true just because tradition protects it.
Right.
And if we connect this back to the broader narrative of structural integrity, the physical battle in the trench and the social battle inside the homes were fundamentally the exact same struggle.
They both require you to hold the line against overwhelming force.
Precisely. It takes immense physical courage to stand in a freezing ditch facing 10,000 swords, obviously. But it takes equal, if not greater, moral courage to face down established power structures and deeply ingrained unjust societal norms within your own culture.
To look at your own people and say, this tradition we have practiced for generations is a lie, and we are stopping it today.
Yes.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone listening to this right now. You know, you might be walking your dog, or you're a mid-level manager dealing with a toxic corporate culture, or maybe you're trying to navigate an incredibly complex family dynamic.
Right. Everyday modern struggle.
Yeah. You aren't digging a literal trench in the Arabian rock to keep out swordsmen, and you are fighting ancient tribal marriage laws. So how do we translate this extreme historical context into the 21st century for you?
We have to translate the 10,000-man army into whatever represents overwhelming, disproportionate odds in your life today.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, that might be a company you poured your entire life savings into, facing sudden, unavoidable bankruptcy due to a market crash.
Yeah, that's a 10,000-man army.
Right. Or it might be a severe, completely unexpected health diagnosis that just derails your entire future in a single afternoon.
Absolutely.
Or it might even be a period of intense professional pressure where you are trying to act ethically in an industry that rewards corruption. You feel entirely surrounded and outnumbered by people just waiting for you to cave or fail.
I look at that translation, and what I find so profoundly validating in the historical account is that it normalizes the terror of those moments.
It really does.
The text literally says the believers were shaken with a severe shaking. It does not sell you this toxic positivity idea that if you're a good, strong, mindful person, you won't feel fear.
No, not at all.
The fear, the eyes turning dull, the heart rising into the throat, the sleepless nights, that it is the correct natural human response to a 10,000-man army. The moral failure isn't feeling the fear.
No, the failure is what you do with it.
Right. The failure is becoming like the hypocrites who let the fear dictate their actions. Who let it turn them to treachery, who abandon their posts and start manufacturing polite excuses about their houses being exposed to justify why they're walking away from their responsibilities.
It's all about the response.
Yeah. The standard isn't fearlessness. The standard is steadfastness in the face of the shaking. You are allowed to shake, you just aren't allowed to break.
That is a crucial distinction. But we have to remember our dual theme here. Surviving the 10,000-man army is only half the test.
Oh, right.
The other half, the much more insidious half, is surviving the victory, surviving the comfort.
This is where it gets scary.
It does. And this is where the historical warning of Saba in chapter 34 becomes incredibly relevant, perhaps even more relevant for a modern listener living in a relatively affluent, industrialized society.
Ah, yes, the story of Saba. Let's really paint this picture for the listener. Saba was this ancient, highly advanced city in Yemen.
Very advanced.
The historical accounts describe them as having 2 gardens on the right and the left. It's this beautiful, poetic symbol of ultimate, inescapable prosperity.
Basically a paradise.
Right. Yeah. They had engineered a massive dam known as the Dike of Mirib that captured the monsoon rains and provided endless, reliable irrigation. They would crack the code of survival.
They really had.
They had the jackpot. They didn't have to worry about droughts or famines like the rest of the ancient world.
They possessed the ultimate climate-controlled environment of their era, but the historical commentary notes that they turned aside.
What does that mean, practically?
It means they became arrogant, ungrateful, and deeply complacent in their luxury. And as a direct result of that complacency, they were destroyed.
But they weren't destroyed by a foreign 10,000-man army.
No, they were destroyed by a flood, the catastrophic bursting of their own dike. The very infrastructure they relied on for their massive wealth became the instrument of their destruction.
And this is where I really want to dig into the how and the why. Because, a massive stone dam doesn't just spontaneously explode because people are acting arrogant.
Right, there's a practical mechanism.
How does moral decay actually lead to infrastructure failure?
It is a phenomenal question of causality. Think about it. When a society becomes entirely obsessed with luxury, ease, and private comfort, what happens to public works?
They get ignored.
Exactly. What happens to collective responsibility? Maintaining a massive, complex piece of engineering like the Dike of Marib requires immense societal discipline. It requires taxes, it requires hard manual labor, it requires engineers who actually care about the future.
It requires looking past tomorrow.
And it requires a leadership class willing to sacrifice short-term profits for long-term stability. But when ease engenders selfishness, the maintenance is deferred.
The funds are embezzled.
The labor force is neglected, yeah. The dam didn't just suddenly break one sunny afternoon. It rotted over decades from a profound lack of societal discipline. The structural integrity was compromised by complacency long before the water finally broke through.
Man, that is terrifyingly applicable to today. And the commentary ties this directly to another really strange but powerful metaphor in the text regarding King Solomon's successor, Rehoboam.
Yes.
The accounts use this bizarre image of a creature of the earth, essentially a termite or a wood-boring worm, eating away at Solomon's staff while he is leaning on it.
It is one of the most profound metaphors for institutional decay I've ever encountered. Think about King Solomon for a second. Historically, he built this massive, unparalleled, highly disciplined kingdom.
He was the ultimate architect.
Right. But after him, the leadership changed hands. And the historical analysis suggests that instead of maintaining the rigorous discipline and ethical standards that built the kingdom in the first place, his successors just yielded to the pleasure-seeking wishes of their companions.
They got soft.
They adopted luxurious habits, they wanted an easy mode of life, they wanted all the prestige without any of the sacrifice.
So that's the worm.
Exactly. The worm eating the staff represents how a great institution, a great company, or a great nation doesn't usually fall because an external enemy knocks it over. It falls because it rots from the inside out.
I mean, I see this constantly in modern corporate life.
Oh, all the time.
You have a founder who just grinds for 20 years. They build a revolutionary product in a garage. They sleep on the floor. They face down the 10,000-man army of aggressive competitors and hostile regulations.
They do the hard work.
They build an empire through sheer grit. Then they retire, and the next generation of leadership comes in. And these new leaders, they just want the corner offices.
They want the perks.
They want the lavish corporate retreats. They want the stock buybacks to boost their bonuses. They want the easy life. They are the termite eating the staff.
It's spot on.
They methodically hollow out the structural foundations of the company just to fund their comfort, and eventually the whole thing snaps under its own weight.
Which forces a very uncomfortable reflection for all of us, regardless of our tax bracket, really. Are we actively building resilience, or are we just aggressively accumulating comfort?
Oof.
Because the clear historical warning here is that comfort, without a tether to a higher moral purpose or a rigorous discipline, is basically a slow-acting poison. It degrades your ability to survive the next inevitable shake table test.
Okay, so if the luxury that destroyed Saba is a slow-acting poison, how do we build immunity to it?
Well, we actually see this tested in real time within the prophet's own home, when the community suddenly strikes it rich.
Which brings us back to the resolution of that domestic siege we mentioned earlier.
Yes, the influx of wealth into Medina. The community was finally economically stable, and the prophet's wives, looking at the changing economic landscape around them, naturally asked for better provisions. They wanted finer clothes, better food, a share in this new affluence that everyone else was enjoying. And it wasn't an evil request. It was a deeply normal human request.
But his response to that normal request is absolutely wild by modern standards.
Completely uncompromising.
He doesn't sit down and negotiate. He doesn't say, okay, the Treasury's doing well. We can upgrade the house a little bit, maybe get some better fabric, but let's keep it reasonable.
Right. There's no middle ground offered.
He offers them a stark binary ultimatum. He basically says, if you desire this world's life and its ornaments, the wealth, the status, the comfort, I will give you a generous financial provision right now, and I will allow you to depart.
I will divorce you.
Exactly. I will divorce you, and you can go live that life. But if you desire a higher purpose, if you want to stay with me, then you must accept strict, uncompromising simplicity.
And the historical commentary is quick to point out a crucial fact here. They all chose to stay with him, fully accepting the life of extreme simplicity. But what is vital to understand here is the underlying mechanism, the why behind such an extreme ultimatum. The commentary argues vehemently that this wasn't about punishing his wives or being controlling or being ascetic just for the sake of suffering.
Okay, then what was it about?
It was about the absolute non-negotiable necessity of a leader remaining completely untethered to material gain.
Oh, I see exactly why that was necessary. Because if he had suddenly started living in a palace, wearing silk and hoarding gold the moment the community got some money.
His critics would have had a field day.
And there were many critics. They would have immediately pointed and said, see, we told you. He was an imposter all along. It was never about a divine message or ethical reform. It was just a long con to get rich and powerful.
Exactly. The integrity of the entire movement rested on his personal motives being utterly beyond reproach. To maintain pure motives and to serve as a credible exemplar for his followers, his simplicity had to be unshakable.
It had to be visible and constant.
Yes. The historical records show that he retained the utmost simplicity of life, sleeping on a rough mat, eating basic food, mending his own shoes while he was actually ruling an expanding country and controlling vast treasuries.
That's incredible.
The commentary argues that this level of material detachment while holding supreme political power is virtually unparalleled in human history. It's an extreme historical example, yes, but the underlying principle of untethering from material corruption is incredibly relevant for anyone in leadership today.
I want to turn this into a practical exercise for you, the listener. Let's do what I call an affluence audit.
Oh, I like that.
I want you to really look at your life right now. Are there comforts, luxuries, or status symbols that are quietly, invisibly compromising your core values? Let me give you a very specific modern scenario. We call them golden handcuffs.
The classic trap.
Exactly. Let's say you are offered a job that pays $250,000 a year. It comes with a prestigious title, stock options, the works. But within the first month, you realize the company culture is deeply toxic.
Right.
You realize you are expected to look the other way on environmental regulations, or lie to investors, or work 80 hours a week and completely neglect your children.
That is the modern iteration of the termite eating the staff. It is the slow rot of your personal integrity for the sake of the ornaments of the world.
So the question you have to ask yourself is, are you making decisions just to maintain a certain lifestyle, even if it means acting unethically? If you were offered that massive upgrade in your lifestyle, but taking it meant fundamentally compromising your core mission or your integrity, could you walk away?
That's the real test.
Could you choose the strict simplicity of your values, maybe taking a massive pay cut to work somewhere honest over the ornaments of the world? The text demands that we make a conscious, painful choice between what it calls the latter abode, which is the higher enduring ethical purpose, and temporary worldly ornaments.
It is a brutal test of character, because walking away from comfort when it is freely offered is arguably harder than surviving the 10,000-man army.
Seriously?
I think so. When the army attacks, adrenaline helps you fight. It's a survival instinct. When the golden handcuffs are offered, everything in your biology and sociology tells you to accept them.
Right. Society tells you you've won.
Exactly. It requires a profound level of self-awareness to recognize that the comfort is actually a trap.
It is incredibly tough. But, it isn't the only tough thing in these chapters. There are parts of this historical account that are going to make a modern reader, particularly a Western reader, deeply uncomfortable.
Yes.
We have to talk about navigating countercultural offense.
Yeah.
Specifically, the historical account of the prophet's marriage to Zainab.
Right. The text deals extensively with this event, and the historical commentary notes that it has caused immense friction for centuries. It has drawn incredibly heavy, often vitriolic criticism from various historians and writers, which the author of our source text addresses head-on.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I want to push back hard here. To a modern ear, and clearly to critics at the time, the basic facts of this event sound like a tabloid scandal.
They definitely do.
They sound awful. Zainab was the divorced wife of Zayd, and Zayd was the prophet's adopted son. So the leader of this movement marries his adopted son's ex-wife. I'm just going to say it. That looks terrible.
Oh, absolutely.
It looks like nepotism. It looks scandalous. Why is a story that causes such an absolute optics disaster front and center in a sacred text?
I completely understand the modern revulsion. I do. And to understand the why, we have to completely strip away our 21st century understanding of adoption and rely entirely on the historical sociological context provided in the commentary.
Okay, lay it out for me.
In 7th century tribal Arabia, an adopted son was considered literal biological blood.
Really?
Yes. It was a polite societal fiction, but it was treated as absolute unbreakable law. If you adopted someone, they took your tribal name, they inherited exactly as a biological child would, and critically, all the marital and incest prohibitions of a biological child applied to them in perpetuity.
So under their customary law, an adopted son's wife was legally and socially viewed exactly the same as a biological son's wife, which makes marrying her technically incest under their rules.
Yes. It was a massive, unbreakable taboo. But we have to look at what the text was doing structurally. The text was systematically dismantling the legal fictions that govern tribal Arabia.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
Remember the zihar custom we discussed?
Yeah.
The man saying his wife was like his mother's back, trapping her forever?
Right. The text abolished that by establishing the principle that words don't change reality.
Exactly. A lie doesn't become truth just because you say it loudly. The commentary explains that the text was applying that exact same rigorous logic to the institution of adoption.
Calling someone a son doesn't alter their DNA.
Exactly. It doesn't erase their actual lineage or their biological parents. The text was trying to clear up the immense legal, social, and inheritance chaos that this polite fiction caused. They wanted to establish that while caring for orphans is noble and highly encouraged, you cannot overwrite biological reality with a verbal decree.
Okay, I follow the logic, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Why couldn't he just give a speech? He's the undisputed leader.
Why couldn't he just stand up in the mosque, issue a decree, and say, hey, everyone, the laws on adoption are changing. Adopted kids are no longer considered blood relatives for the purposes of marriage and inheritance. Take note, update your records.
Right.
Why did he have to personally involve himself in this massive scandal by marrying Zainab after her marriage with Zayd fell apart?
That is the crucial question. And the historical commentary argues that in an honor-bound tribal society, a mere verbal decree to break a taboo that deeply entrenched would have been utterly useless.
They would have just ignored it.
People would have politely nodded
Right.
and then completely ignored it. Or, more likely, they would have been too terrified of the inevitable societal backlash, the loss of honor, to ever actually act on it. A piece of paper or a speech doesn't rewrite centuries of cultural programming.
Wow, okay.
To shatter the norm, a highly visible, highly controversial, undeniable public act was required by the supreme leader himself.
The text actually states it was a divine command, explicitly so. There should be no difficulty for the believers in respect of the wives of their adopted sons.
Yes.
It's basically saying the leader had to take the heat, he had to absorb the scandal so that nobody else down the line would be punished or shamed for breaking the old law.
That is exactly the argument. He had to demonstrate that the old law was dead by crossing the line himself. And the commentary goes into great detail to refute the historical accusations that this was driven by personal lust or desire.
Which was the main criticism, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. But it points out several vital facts. Zainab was his own first cousin. He had known her his entire life. She wasn't a stranger he suddenly desired. Furthermore, it was the Prophet himself who originally insisted on arranging the marriage between Zainab and Zayd in the first place.
Oh, interesting.
And that original marriage was deeply controversial because it crossed rigid class lines. Zayd was a freedman, a former slave, and Zainab was from a high-status noble family.
He forced them to marry, to break a class taboo, and it backfired.
Yes, it was mismatch. When that marriage inevitably failed due to deep-seated personality and class conflicts, the historical records state the Prophet was deeply, profoundly reluctant to marry her.
Because he knew the fallout.
He knew exactly what it would look like. He knew the massive political and social scandal it would cause. He feared the public backlash and the damage to his reputation. But the commentary argues that the divine imperative essentially told him, you must fear the truth more than you fear public opinion.
You must establish this legal precedent, regardless of the PR disaster.
Exactly.
Man, that reframes the entire event. The obstacle for us is that modern listeners resist this narrative because it clashes so heavily with our views on optics.
We are obsessed with optics.
We live in an era of public relations, spin, and managing our brand. We care desperately about how things look.
And that is precisely the enduring, uncomfortable value we can extract from this historical event.
The willingness to look bad for a cause.
Yes. The takeaway for a modern listener isn't about the nuances of adoption laws in the 21st century. The enduring lesson is about the brutal courage required to demolish a societal falsehood, even when you know with absolute certainty that you will be viciously misunderstood, slandered, and criticized for it.
That is huge.
If you are in leadership and you know a system is fundamentally broken or based on a lie, do you have the courage to take the PR hit to fix it? Most corporate or political leaders today would run screaming from that kind of optics disaster.
They would totally sweep it under the rug to protect their brand.
Without a doubt. But the historical text argues that true leadership sometimes requires walking directly into the fire of a scandal for the sake of long-term truth and structural reform.
Taking the hit so the people behind you don't have to.
Exactly.
That is a heavy, challenging takeaway.
Yeah.
But, it's not the only area in these chapters where we need to exercise extreme caution about historical context. There are some highly specific rules regarding domestic conduct in Chapter 33.
There are. The chapter contains incredibly detailed instructions for believers regarding how to interact with the Prophet's household.
Give me some examples.
For example, it instructs them not to enter his houses unless explicitly invited for a meal. And importantly, not to linger after eating just to engage in idle chat.
Right.
It also contains very specific injunctions for the Prophet's wives and women generally regarding drawing their overgarments close around them when they go out in public.
Okay, let's tackle the clothing rule first, because anytime a religious text starts mandating women's clothing, it immediately sets off massive alarm bells for modern readers.
It feels oppressive, yes.
Right. But the historical commentary gives a very specific, deeply troubling socio-political reason for this rule at that time, right?
Yes, and it is a context that is essential to understand, even if it is uncomfortable. The historical analysis notes that in that specific rough tribal society in Medina, there was a stark, brutal distinction made in the streets between free women and enslaved women. The injunction for free women to wear a distinguishing overgarment was explicitly designed so they would be immediately recognized as free women.
And why was that distinction so critical on the street?
So they would not be subjected to the harassment, assault, or ill treatment that was tragically and horrifically commonly directed at enslaved women with total impunity.
Wow. Okay, so this is where discernment is absolutely vital for a modern reader. We shouldn't read this and say, the enduring divine wisdom here is that we should endorse a 7th century social hierarchy that actively accepts slavery and enforces specific dress codes based on class.
No. That would be a catastrophic misreading of the text.
Exactly.
We have to ruthlessly separate the ugly 7th century socio-political reality from the underlying moral principle.
So what is the principle here?
The underlying principle of the clothing rule at that specific violent moment in history was societal safety. It was an attempt to provide respect and physical protection for vulnerable people in an environment where law enforcement basically didn't exist. Right. The specific mechanism they used to achieve that a distinguishing cloak was entirely bound by the limitations and cruelties of their time. But the pursuit of safety, dignity, and bodily autonomy is the universal principle we extract.
That makes a lot of sense. You extract the intent, not the ancient mechanism. Now, what about the rule about the guests lingering? I have to be honest, it seems almost comedic that an instruction like, please leave my house after dinner, made it into a sacred historical text alongside, the abolition of ancient laws and the survival of sieges.
It sounds mundane, doesn't it? But it speaks volumes about the immense, crushing burden of ancient leadership.
How so?
Think about the prophet's role at that exact moment. He was simultaneously the head of state, the supreme religious leader, the chief judge, and the military commander in an active war zone.
Right, he's wearing every hat.
And his physical house was the de facto center of the community. The historical record suggests people were constantly coming in, eating his food, asking for advice, and just hanging around indefinitely, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was physically and mentally exhausted.
And the commentary notes that he was simply too polite or maybe too conscious of his role as a gracious host to tell them to get out.
Precisely. The social pressure of hospitality in Arab culture is immense. You don't just kick guests out. So, the text intervened. It essentially provided a divine mandate to establish a boundary for his mental peace and physical recovery.
It gave him permission to close the door.
It gave him permission to say no, exactly.
I look at that lingering guest rule, and it instantly makes me think of my phone buzzing with Slack messages at 9 p.m. on a Friday.
Oh, yeah.
We don't necessarily have people literally sitting in our living rooms eating our food and refusing to leave, but we live in a culture of hyperconnectivity that demands infinite, unyielding access to our attention and our energy.
Exhausting.
Our bosses, our apps, our social media, they are the lingering guests of the 21st century.
That is a brilliant modern translation. If a historical leader bearing the weight of a nation needed an explicit mandate to finally set a boundary, tell people to go home and get some rest, it gives every modern listener absolute permission to aggressively protect their own space.
This text essentially says it's not just okay, it's a moral imperative to lock the door. You have to build your own curtains, as the text calls them, to guard your time, your mental energy, and your family from the constant draining intrusion of the outside world.
You have to secure your own oxygen mask first.
Right, or you can't lead anyone else.
The structural integrity of a person requires downtime. If the shake table is always on, the building will eventually fall.
Now, I want to zoom out a bit as we bring all these themes together. We've been very focused on Medina, the specific struggles of this one community, their sieges, their domestic disputes. But when you look at chapters 35, 36, and 37, the text does something really remarkable.
It does.
It explicitly connects this highly localized struggle to a massive global historical narrative.
It does, and it represents a massive paradigm shift. In chapter 35, the text makes a highly universalistic claim. It states unequivocally that a prophet, a warner, was raised among every nation on earth.
Every nation.
Every nation. The commentary points out that this broad doctrine, the idea that divine guidance and the struggle for truth was not limited to one specific chosen tribe or one geographic region, but was a universal human phenomenon distributed to all humanity throughout history, was a revolutionary, deeply egalitarian idea.
Especially in an era defined by intense tribalism and exceptionalism. right?
Absolutely.
And chapter 37, which is titled The Rangers, really leans into this universal history. It lists a long, continuous line of historical figures: Noah, Abraham, Moses, Lot, and Jonah.
Right.
It tells their stories. And the historical commentary draws very specific, very intentional parallels between what those ancient figures went through and what the Muslims in Medina were going through right then.
It is actively contextualizing the immediate suffering of its audience. For example, the commentary draws a direct, explicit line between the struggles of Moses and Muhammad.
How so?
Well, just as Moses was falsely accused, slandered, and resisted by his own people, and we see this corroborated in the biblical tradition too, like in the book of Numbers, where Miriam and Aaron speak against his marriage, Muhammad faced similar false imputations regarding his domestic life, his motives, and his authority.
So the text is essentially saying to the people in Medina, look, I know you are shivering in a trench right now. I know you are starving. I know people are spreading vicious rumors about your leader and your families, but you need to understand that you are not alone and you are not anomalies. You are part of a universal, ancient fraternity of struggle.
A fraternity of struggle. I like that.
Whether it's the Israelites suffering under the tyranny of Pharaoh, or Noah building a boat while his entire society mocks him as a madman, or the Muslims digging a ditch to survive a 10,000-man siege, the pursuit of structural integrity and truth always meets institutional resistance.
The comparative takeaway here is profound for anyone trying to do something meaningful today. It suggests that encountering massive resistance, facing a siege, or dealing with slander isn't necessarily a sign that you are doing something wrong.
Right.
Historically speaking, it is the most consistent sign that you are actually doing something right. Every messenger of truth, every reformer across every culture and era faced a 10,000-man army in one form or another.
They all faced the hypocrites undermining them from within and the attackers trying to destroy them from without.
That reframes the concept of struggle completely.
It totally does. It takes it from a place of victimhood, why is this terrible thing happening to me, to a place of profound purpose. This is simply what happens when you stand for something real.
Exactly. It elevates the suffering from random, meaningless misfortune to a purposeful continuation of the grand human legacy of seeking justice, truth, and integrity. You aren't just suffering, you are participating in history.
Wow. We've covered a massive, intense amount of ground today. We started with the terrifying external shake table of a physical siege in the freezing cold. We looked at the silent, rot-inducing threat of extreme comfort and luxury that destroyed Saba.
The termite in the staff.
Right. We analyzed the immense moral courage required to break ancient societal taboos and absorb the PR disaster. We discussed the absolute unapologetic necessity of setting boundaries for our own mental health against the lingering guests of modern life.
Blocking the door.
And finally, the realization that our personal, isolated struggles might just be our entry ticket into a very long, very noble human tradition of resilience.
It is a remarkable, comprehensive synthesis of physical survival, psychological endurance, and moral integrity.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought on that massive external siege from chapter 33. We talk about the 10,000-man army surrounding the city. The Muslims dug the ditch, they held the line in the freezing cold, they dealt with the panic and the traitors inside their own walls. But here is the fascinating historical reality. They didn't actually defeat the army in a traditional clash of swords.
They didn't.
According to the text and the historical commentary, the massive enemy force was ultimately defeated by a sudden, freak weather event. A freezing hurricane blew in off the desert.
Just out of nowhere.
It extinguished the enemy's fires, it blew down their tents, it terrified their horses, and it broke their morale so completely, so abruptly, that the massive army just packed up and fled in the dead of night.
It's incredible.
Here's the thought I want you to mull over as you face your own odds. When you hold your ground in the trenches of your own life, when you absolutely refuse to give in to the panic of the 10,000 arrayed against you, and when you refuse to let the termite of comfort rot your foundation, the relief often comes from a direction you could never have engineered, predicted, or controlled.
That's right.
You don't always have to defeat the massive army yourself. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes, the ultimate test of integrity is just surviving the night, holding the line, and waiting for the storm to blow them away. That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.